Good evening and welcome to Tata Literature Live 2022, the 13th Annual Mumbai International Literature Festival in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. To all of you joining us on the very first day of the online avatar of Tata Literature Live 2022, hope you're settled in with a warm cup of coffee and your latest read as we take you through our combined format festival this year. Now, you're going to say, how is that going to work? Let me take you through it. Today and tomorrow, we have 2 days of the online edit of the festival with sessions streaming across all your social media platforms. And then, for those in and around Mumbai who can join us offline, you can join us for the physical edit of the festival at NCPA on Friday, November 11th, Saturday, November 12th, and Sunday, November 13th, and at the St. Paul's Institute of Communication Education and the bookstore Tidal Waves, both in Bandra, on Saturday and Sunday. I'm going to be there, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you all there too. Now, on to our second online session of the day. In post-apartheid South Africa, when power was transferred there, there was an assumption that it's a state project to change South Africa. No one was willing to take up individual responsibility. The political power might have been handed over to the people, but the economic power still remained with a chosen few. South Africa under Nelson Mandela was one of hope and optimism, but that is simply not the case anymore, says our next speaker. His 2021 Booker Prize winning saga, The Promise, is a reflection of a post-apartheid society. Discussing what it means to be South African today, let's meet our two speakers. He is an award-winning South African playwright and novelist. His first novel was published when he was just 17. Since then, he has written 9 books, including a short story collection and Arctic Summer, winner of the Tata Literature Live Book of the Year Award in 2014. He's been shortlisted 3 times for the Booker Prize and finally won in 2021 for his 9th book, The Promise. Please welcome Mr. Damon Galgut. Mr. Galgut will be in conversation with Mr. Salil Tripathi, who lives in New York via London, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Geneva. He is on the board of PEN International, the author of 3 works of nonfiction, and an award-winning editor and journalist writing about politics, economics, literature, and social trends. Please remember to contribute your questions for the Q&A by writing into us via the comment boxes of the platform you're viewing us on at any time through the session. Remember to write in your names as well. So now, let's kick off our session with Mr. Galgut and Mr. Tripathi, South Africa, My Muse.
Thank you. Thank you very much. For anyone who grows up in the Commonwealth, one of the most important literary prizes we know of is the Booker Prize. To be longlisted is itself an honor. To be shortlisted twice and winning it after that, at the 3rd time, is an extraordinary honor. And it's my great pleasure and privilege to have a conversation today with my friend Damon Galgut. Damon was born in South Africa, and he was first nominated for a novel called The Good Doctor in 2003, and then in 2010 for a truly brilliant and disturbing novel called In a Strange Room. I say disturbing because it presents India in a very harrowing and interesting light, and we will talk about that as we go on. But the novel is known most for in recent days, is A Promise, which won the Booker Prize. The Promise is an extraordinary novel for several reasons. When I grew up at college in Mumbai or Bombay, the novel to read about South Africa was Ellen Patton's The Cry, the Beloved the Country. And that's the novel that told you about the reality of that country. As I grew older, I read Nadine Gordimer, and there was Berger's Daughter, The Conservationist, and July's People. But the one story that captures the story of South Africa's present with all its nuances and magnificently is indeed The Promise. I first went to South Africa in 1990. It was a very interesting time. Nelson Mandela had become free. There was a promise of the Rainbow Nation. At the Jan Smuts Airport, as it was called, the CODESA, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, and the writing of the new constitution, conversations were going on. De Klerk and Mandela were shaking hands. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in place. And it seemed the world was full of possibilities. I remember asking Nadine Gordimer at that time, what kind of fiction will come out of this? And she said it will be about the current reality. Then in 1999, of course, J.M. Coetzee won the Booker Prize with Disgrace. But let's talk about this one novel, The Promise, which does such a great job of capturing the reality of post-apartheid South Africa. It starts with the time when Mandela is released and goes on till the time of Jacob Zuma's resignation. It is a story that revolves around 4 funerals. There is Manny, there is Rachel, and their surname is Swart, their Afrikaans name, and which means black. And they have 3 children, Astrid, Anton, and Amor. And there are tragic deaths, and each part of the novel deals with a death, and each captures a particular decade of South Africa. And it talks about how to deal with faith, how to deal with promise, the unkept promises to the Black majority community, and what is theirs. Can it be given by someone who never owned it? These are the kind of profound questions that the novel raises. Damon, when you started writing the novel, did you plan to write the novel that captures the zeitgeist? Did you plan to write something that tells the story where it is, to pick up the thread from where it needs to be, or did it evolve on its own?
Firstly, Salil, let me say thank you for that incredibly generous introduction, and it's nice to be talking to you. I have to think back to my state of mind when I began writing the book, which was, of course, some years ago by now. But I believe, like most novels, it arrived in waves rather than as a, complete entity. My initial impulse really came out of a conversation with a friend where he was telling me about 4 family funerals. And I thought at that time, well, I've read a lot of stories, novels about families, but I've not read one with a particular structure like this. So the book is split into 4 sections, each one happening in a different decade, and each one focused on the death and funeral of a particular family member. But I don't think my initial attention was on much more than that. I wanted to write a book about the passing of time and about a particular white South African family, not that dissimilar to mine. I mean, it's not based on my family, but it's not totally dissimilar. But then, having meditated on it and perhaps worked with it a bit, other aspects of the novel, which have added, I hope, some depth to it, attached themselves. And one of those was the idea that if I just widened the window of each of those sections of the book just a little bit, I could take in some of the background, which is to say what was happening to the nation at that particular time. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you, South Africa has been through some convulsive historical changes over the last 40 years. So yeah, although it was a secondary consideration, the life of the nation and what time has done to South Africa is very, very much part of the book too. But it wasn't necessarily what first drew me to it.
And to what extent is the South Africa story unique? Because, when we look at it, in a way, the reality was always very stark. White and black, apartheid, laws which were codified. Other countries have problems with discrimination, of course. India is no exception at all. Whether it's minorities and Muslims or whether it is Dalits. But in South Africa, it was somehow codified in law, which made it very simple, that binary. So does that make it easier or more difficult to write about South Africa?
Well, I don't know, because I've not had the experience of living in any other society. I mean, to pick up on one aspect of what you've just said, I've been surprised by the number of people from other societies, including very much India, who've come to me after various events to say how similar they felt the situation was to where they come from. But of course, you're correct. There are hierarchical structural divisions in lots of societies, but not many of them, if any, have been codified into enforced legal separation between races, which is what apartheid was. Separate but equal was the apartheid mantra. As the truth is, it was separate, but really not very equal.
I remember, Damon, when I first came to South Africa, I remember some of the government officials very proudly saying that we are two countries in one. We are first world and third world at the same time, as though it was something they should be proud of.
As though it was an achievement, indeed.
Yes, yes.
That perception, of course, continues that we are two nations. Thabo Mbeki famously pointed that out in one of his speeches and got a lot of pushback from white South Africans, but it's very clearly true. There are at least two nations, and it's not something to be proud of, not at all. I'm not sure whether it makes it easier to write about. I mean, there's a part of every writer's brain which is almost detached from the moral aspects of what it's describing. I mean, as Graham Greene put it, you have to have a splinter of ice in your heart to be a writer. And if you look at South Africa's pain and try not to feel it yourself, of course, the themes are rich, very powerful for any writer to be delving into. But, in the same way that the country's fractured, its literature is fractured too. I mean, I would not really feel qualified to speak for Black South Africa, that part of our nation. And I think most Black South Africans would not feel qualified or want to speak for white South Africa. So it's part of the complexity, maybe an aspect of our country, which is still at this point insurmountable, is the fact that we write from within our own bubbles, actually. And, I'm certainly absolutely caught up in that. I mean, this is a book very much about white South Africa and white South Africans.
Yeah, absolutely. And the silence of Salome is very, very eloquent in that, because she doesn't speak much, but when she does, it's very powerful. And so does the son Lucas, when he says at the end what the land is all about. So that's terrific. I wanted to go back to this mood of, almost naive hope that everybody had about South Africa with the kind of extremely liberal constitution the country gave itself. And, the whole idea of forgiveness and Mandela being, everybody's favorite president, and even people like Margaret Thatcher saying that, that he was my friend, which was rather ironic. But in that kind of a context, and what has become of it now, and you capture that. I mean, in The Imposter also, you talk about this person who's trying to get this person who wants to become the poet in the Karoo, and how he tries to get him to be part in an exercise of complicity. This rise of crime, the rise of violence, rise of inequality. So is it a very despairing place now? Would you say that? Or do you think that it's just becoming a normal country with the expectations taken off from its shoulders?
I'm glad you mentioned the naivety of the hope we had in the 90s, because looking back now at that period, it does seem naive. I think there's justification for the naivety in the sense that we came out of a political system which was so all-powerful and dominant that we really had no experience of how politics operates in the real world. When apartheid fell and we had democratic elections for the first time, there was a real innocence to most, South Africans. We didn't know that politics is as brutal, dishonest, and compromised as it is, in the real world. We've learned that lesson now. So in one way, it's fair to say that we've become a far more normal country. In another way, I think it's also fair to say that the ideals of that time have been betrayed. We ought to be in a far better place than we are now. And I mean, just to put it in very simplistic terms, if all the money that has been stolen over the last 30 years, had instead been spent on housing or education, we would be in a very different place. I don't understand, personally speaking, why there has not been, a massive public works program like there was in the New Deal in America in the Great Depression, which would provide, a basic living wage to many, many people, as well as building up some infrastructure in areas that desperately need it. I mean, I'm not an economist, but these seem to me simple and obvious solutions to the crisis we were in. Instead, what's happened is that, a huge amount of public money has been plundered. Far more worrying is that there has not been and still is not any kind of vision or plan to turn the situation around. So it's the truth, I'm afraid, and not a truth I get any pleasure in sharing with you, that we are in a pretty despairing place right now. I cannot remember a time since the dark days of apartheid when I felt less optimistic about our future. And I'm sorry to say that, because most of us hoped things would be very, very different.
No, absolutely. And the other question I have is about the Indians in South Africa. And this comes, there are layers to the question, because when you ask people in India, there's this wonderful cliche that, Gandhi went there and, in 1890s, and he was an important feature of the history. And most South Africans tell me that, yes, you sent us Barrister Gandhi and we gave you the Mahatma. I mean, this is something that even Ramchandra Guha refers to in his first part of this biography of Gandhi. So you have that as one level, and the other is element of justified pride that in 1948, it was that when the apartheid was declared by the National Party, under Jawaharlal Nehru, India was the first country to impose comprehensive economic sanctions. Now, whether sanctions are good or bad is a different question, and we can visit it another time. But it did take a very strong moral stance as the land of Gandhi on that issue. But from that, of course, there has been rethinking about Gandhi for the remarks he made in 1900s about the Black community, using the kind of terms he used, which were in vogue at that time. Then I remember when I used to come to South Africa much more frequently than now, there was a song by Mbongeni Gema, which was very critical of the Indian community, the whole cricket batting scandal. And then, of course, we have the Gupta family, which is a very different kind of Indians who come to South Africa. So, which was a long way of asking, has India frittered the goodwill it had in South Africa?
Well, it's a complex question, and there are probably multiple answers to it. I mean, there are still very, very close ties, obviously, between India and South Africa. I think the largest community of Indians outside India is in my country, India. In fact. But of course, any community of people has its good and its bad elements. I mean, that's as true of the Indian community as it is of the white community. And none of us would like to be represented by, the worst aspects of our community. I think it's far more nuanced and multifaceted, that connection, because many Indians have been part of the resistance struggle to apartheid. Some of them quite famously were jailed along with Mandela and other figures. And it's of course
being one of them, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And of course, it's true to say that sanctions were what brought down apartheid. I mean, the white nationalist government didn't have an altruistic change of heart. They were pressured into giving up their ways. So Indians have been very much a part of the liberation of South Africa. And then, other Indians have been part of the exploitation of South Africa, but then so have people from various communities. There's an enormous amount of, I shouldn't say enormous amount because it's not something I can measure, but there is a discernible element of resentment and racism from some parts of Black South Africa towards Indians. I'm not sure what exactly that's based on. I think it's a political tool because it has a kind of leverage in certain parts of the electorate, and some unscrupulous politicians will use that lever.
Could you think it had something to do with the fact that when you had the tricameral parliament, Indians did have a house of their own in the parliament, they were elected, so they were not truly privileged, but they had access to certain benefits which the Black community did not have?
Well, that structure of the tricameral parliament is in itself a symptom of something deeper, which is, of course, the hierarchy of race that apartheid imposed. So, we've been talking about two nations, Black and white, but in fact, if you were mixed race, so-called colored in South Africa, which is not a pejorative, by the way, not in our country, not any longer anyway, or Indian, you occupied a slightly higher status than if you were a Black South African. That meant you were bottom of the pile. Now, that really did create levels of resentment towards other racial groups from Black South Africans, which is understandable. And some of that resentment remains. It's natural if you have a slightly superior advantage, you're going to try and use it in ways to further yourself or your community. And I guess some people have been guilty of that. But again, to stress, there were lots of Indians who did not operate in that way and who were part of the ANC and its non-racial approach. So it's very complicated. But yeah, apartheid did impose a lot of fractures, which last until today, unfortunately.
And the other question I have is on the Afrikaner community, because again, one of the first books I read before my first trip was Mark de Villiers' book called White Tribe Dreaming, which begins with this statement where someone asks a particular Afrikaner, where are you from? And he says, I'm from here. And the whole book is a kind of an examination about what here means. At the same time, we know that as the apartheid was ending, a lot of people were leaving, and a lot of them going to Australia, some going to Canada and England from the white community. To what extent does the white South African feel at home? And now, and is it home really? Can it really be home?
Well, again, a very contentious question. I mean, there have been numerous waves of emigration from the white community in South Africa. A lot of people left in the 1960s who could not live under apartheid. More recently, a lot of people have left because they can't live without it, apparently. So, people have multiple motives for wanting to go. But again, the white community is not a homogenous entity. It's made up of, people from all kinds of backgrounds. You mentioned
dissidents in London. So many dissidents were there during London. I remember that.
Indeed. And, many Afrikaners, again, joined the struggle against apartheid. Some of them were jailed. So one cannot speak of them, or paint them rather with one brush.
Yeah.
I mean, my own background is English-speaking South African. And in a strange way, I think English-speaking whites have, well, again, one can't make sweeping statements, but have an easier time with the idea of living elsewhere. There's always been half one's brain rooted in England, and England being the kind of mother country in the mind of a lot of South Africans. Whereas Afrikaners more generally, I guess, feel they have nowhere else to go. They need to, stick together as a group and look out for themselves, which is a mentality that goes right back to, colonial days, the very, very early days, when the first whites to leave the colony in the Cape were Afrikaners, because they felt they did not want to live under English law and English rule. So these fractures are still part of our mentality, and they still, play a part. I mean, speaking for myself, there is no other country where I feel at home. I long to feel I belong there in South Africa. What one does to qualify living as an African alongside other Africans is a different matter, because it's become a little bit of quite a large part of political debate these days. And of course, there's a radical African position that says no whites belong in Africa, and we should all go home. Well, frankly, if I have to go home, it's home to Pretoria. I don't have any other place that I came from. So in a funny way, there's a big political flashpoint around the issue of land in South Africa now. It's the kind of main plank of the political platform of at least one of our parties, the radical EFF. And if you really look at it, land in itself is not a solution, because you can give everybody a piece of land, but not everyone's going to be able to do something productive with that land. It's more symbolic. And my understanding of it is the symbolism means everybody wants to feel they have a place in the world, in South Africa, a root, a sense of belonging, which is very understandable to me. And yet, in a funny way, very few South Africans have that sense, truly. White South Africans don't feel, or I don't think should feel, entitled to the land they occupy. It was taken from other people. Black South Africans were forcibly dispossessed of their land and made non-citizens under apartheid, and that has yet to be, set right. So there is a great turmoil about land and about the right to belonging, with all the multiple debates and conversations that entails.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up land, because it segues into what I was going to ask you, because one of the most memorable encounters that I remember, Colm Toibin and you in Brooklyn, I think about earlier this year or late last year, I can't remember when exactly it was, where he begins by describing the beautiful land, and you are driving, the two of you together, and he talks about the land and the notion of money and the inequality. And I was going to ask about the economic freedom fighters as well. How plausible is that scenario? Because the whole compromise of 1989 or 1991 or CODESA was that there wouldn't be an expropriation of land of those who are sitting on the land right now. And even Promise actually deals with that, where the land was not for Rachel and Manny to give it to Salome. Because under the laws, they could not have done it at that time. That's the way the papers were. So how is that land dynamic being played out, and how acute is the inequality, and should we all take Julius Malema more seriously?
Well, he should be taken seriously in the sense that he's articulating the position of a whole new, very angry generation in South Africa, and also a large part of an older generation which feels betrayed and let down by the broken promise of 94. We all believed things were going to be different, and they aren't. Land is, as I said, symbolic, but, meaningful. It's recently legislation was passed which does allow the government to expropriate land without compensation. So, that undertaking no longer applies. Whether the government will actually do it or not is another matter. I think they've passed this law under pressure, and the pressure has largely come from the left in the form of the EFF. Again, I think land stands in for a lot of other things. So what we're hearing and what we're seeing is the anger of people who see that although apartheid is technically off the statute books, the situation that apartheid bequeathed us is exactly or more or less unchanged. So the same people who used to have money and power still have money and power, and they're mostly white people. The same people who had none of the money and power still have no money and power, and they're mostly people of color. So, you could say that, the more cosmetic or superficial aspects of apartheid have changed, but the very profound economic implications of apartheid have not been transformed. And that's the crisis we sit with. Lucas, who's the son of Salome in my book, has a very angry diatribe at the end towards Amor, when Amor feels she's fulfilling the promise and handing over this land to Salome. And I let Lucas articulate what I felt to be the anger of this new generation, who didn't grow up under apartheid, incidentally. They're a generation of so-called born frees, who are nevertheless as angry as, people from past generations. And Colm Toibin, who you mentioned, said when he read the book that he thought Lucas's voice was the voice of the future. Well, it remains to be seen. Julius Malema is still the leader of a party that, seems to have capped its popularity at about 10% of the vote, but that can change. Who knows? Politics is a volatile quantity, especially in South Africa. I think there would be profound alarm right across the board if Julius Malema and his party ever came to power. But we're in a time when the ANC, the ruling party, seems to be in a state of crisis, could implode. If that happens, it's a different game, and the future's up for grabs. I wouldn't care to be a prophet, actually, on that score.
Yeah. No, it could be grim. And that was my next question, which was about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the role it played. everyone loved it, as restorative justice. I've worked a fair bit in human rights and retributive versus restorative, and it made a lot of sense. I've read Antti Krog on that too. The question, though, is that did it postpone some of the anger or keep it suppressed? And is it likely to come out in a more, I'm not, you did say you're not a prophet nor a soothsayer, so I'm not trying to put you on a spot that way, but I'm just curious that, because I'll tell you why, because another question that came up in your conversation with Colm was Mandela and his legacy, because you mentioned the born-free generation. You have an entire generation of people who have grown up only in an independent South Africa and who have no memory of the past and who are angry at the inequality that they see, that we have the right to vote and we can sit on the bench and we can go to a swimming pool or a beach. But other than that, what do we have? So is that resentment really bubbling, or is that something that can be contained?
Well, we're going to find out very soon. The resentment is very real, and I think understandable. I don't think I don't have faith in the capacity of the state to contain it any longer, except through force. And even then, I don't think they have the capacity. But I don't want to live in a country where discontent is put down with force. We have so far miraculously managed to talk and understand one another to the extent that we did change the platform we were operating from. Along with a lot of other white South Africans, I guess I feel very let down. I shouldn't have said white South Africans. A lot of other South Africans, I feel let down by the ANC, who had the moral credibility actually to follow through on their promises and to change things, but haven't. I think it's the case that South Africa deals in a lot of symbols, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was more symbolic than effective. The number of people who actually came and confessed to political crimes and exonerated themselves was really tiny. There are vast numbers of people involved in all kinds of activities from the apartheid days who have not been heard from. The state also promised all kinds of reparations to people who lost family members or property or whatever it may be in that time, and very few of those have been followed through on. So it was more, to my mind, a symbolic process that made people feel good than a mass scale project of real social justice. I think it was a tiny sticking plaster on a very large wound, which continues to fester, basically. So I don't think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission achieved much beyond a symbolic value. And symbolism is what we seem to do all the time. We change street names, we change the names of cities. And some laws are changed, but as I say, they seem to be of the more cosmetic sort. But deep down, the fundamental inequalities of the society have not been addressed. They needed a radical vision to transform them, and nobody's provided that vision. We are stuck with a neoliberal capitalist model in the vague hope that money trickles down to the poor, and it never does. It never does.
Yes, as Britain is learning now, as we are watching it as we speak. You're in London as we speak, yeah. So there's a very, very, very good passage in one of your works, and I just want to cite three sentences from that. And the question is about the second one. You mean politics, he said, but that's all past now. It doesn't matter anymore. The past has only just happened. It's not past yet. And then the doctor says, I don't care about that. I'm just a doctor. I'm just curious. It's not past yet. So are we still in the present?
Well, partly what I had in mind there was a quote from William Faulkner, who I think famously,
I remember that.
Yeah, who said something more or less along those lines, talking, of course, about the American South, where they're still living with massive racial inequality. There's the same sense in South Africa that, we've been through tremendous upheavals of an extreme sort, far more extreme maybe than a lot of Western societies are familiar with. And the past is not past. As we've just been discussing, the inequalities of South African society are what we're still living with. So until those are addressed, you cannot talk about the past being over. I mean, in fairness to the ANC, they inherited a terrible situation. I mean, I don't know what I would have done to sort out the South Africa that they got, but I'm not the politician, I'm not the economist. It is actually part of their job to come up with some sort of plan, and there doesn't seem to be one. But no, the past is not past in South Africa. You know, in a superficial way. You know, I grew up at a time where I could not share a bench with a person of color. You know, somebody with a darker skin than mine could not walk into a building through the same entrance as me. I could not have a friendship, let alone an intimate relationship with a Black South African. All that has changed, and it would be unfair to say that that's meaningless. Of course it's meaningful. But we need a vision that goes way deeper than these superficial things. Until every South African feels that the playing field is far more level than it is now, and that everyone has an equal shot at a future life in South Africa, we're going to be living through turbulence, and the turbulence, you know, could get a lot worse than it has been so far.
In one of your interviews, you had said that the attraction of fiction for you is not just that it illuminates history, but it can tell you how it feels to be a human being inside history. Can I probe you a bit on that? What does it mean? At what level? Is it a relationship with it as an observer, as a participant?
Well, you know, as this conversation demonstrates, most discussion about a South African novel tends to focus quite strongly on history and politics. And of course, there's a corresponding impulse with South African writers. We all seem to feel to some extent we have to account for where we are historically and politically. You know, these are expectations that maybe not every national literature feels, but they're very real for South Africa. I guess what I meant with that is really, you know, if I want to understand a society at any moment, I would usually turn to journalism or to nonfiction to explain historical forces and processes. Novels, I don't think, should be trying to compete on that level. What is the point? What novels can do, I think, you know, for every suffering and injustice that history deals out to thousands or millions of people, there's a point at which it becomes the very particular suffering and injustice of every individual person that makes up those thousands or millions. And that's where fiction operates, I think. It tells you about the human cost. By focusing on a life or a group of lives and delving into the tissue of emotions, aspirations, hopes and despairs of people and how they live their lives. I mean, what is the point of novels unless they're there to illuminate how it feels to be human? I leave it to history and nonfiction to look at the bigger forces of change in the world. But you know, I'm probably out of step, but I see the ambitions and aspirations of novels as being quite small. I don't turn to novels for you know, a moral pointer to the future or the way forward. You know, the time of Tolstoy and those grand claims, I think, is past. I think the aspirations of novelists should be far more modest. I don't know what the future holds, and I barely know how to live my own life honorably, let alone tell other people how they should be living theirs. But I do have some kind of ability to describe how I feel and how people around me feel at this particular moment in my little corner of the world. And I see that as my job.
Right. One final question before we turn to some questions that we got from readership. And this is about your relationship with India. And I asked for two reasons. One is that, you know, we talked briefly about In a Strange Room, in which India plays an important part. One third of the novel is set in India, and incredibly gripping and incredibly powerful descriptions of mental breakdown and illness there, and what drives people to take their lives. And of course, there is the Arctic Summer, which deals with E.M. Foster, but India plays and his time in Devas and so on. What does India mean to you?
Well, I first visited India back in 1999. I thought I was traveling a lot at that time, visiting places for a couple of months at a time, and I thought India would be one of those trips. But in fact, my relationship with India almost immediately became an incredibly powerful one. And I've been back there 13 times, sometimes for 6 months at a time. I wrote 2 novels while I was there. It was a place that fed me intellectually and emotionally in multiple ways over many, many years. It's been a while since I've been back. I have to say, I feel this will probably be treading on some toes, but I feel far less enamored of India under its current regime. Everything that I thought was most dazzling and most interesting about it, its ability to live with multiple creeds and multiple voices, seems to have narrowed and dimmed, I'm afraid, under your current government. So it's lost a great deal of appeal for me.
Yeah, it's one
again,
nation, one religion, one language, and one food, I think, is the way someone described it the other day.
Well, all fundamentalisms want to bring everything down to one thing, and in the end, it'll be one book too.
Yes, unfortunately. Let's turn to a few of the questions that have come from the reader clubs. Why did you choose death as the peg around which the 4 lives are talked about? I think this is a question about the promise. It's from Himani Sayyed.
I've talked about how I got the idea for the book, which was through a friend who was talking about funerals. So I guess that, in a very immediate way, was the way that the idea was framed for me. But on a deeper level, one needs to be drawn to an idea because it reflects a preoccupation of yours. And my preoccupation more and more is the passage of time, my own mortality, what life means, given that I'm looking back on more of it than lies ahead of me. And the end of that journey for each of us, unfortunately, is a funeral. So it seemed like a logical endpoint, the period at the end of the sentence, as it were.
Yeah, the other question, which I'm going to read out because I'm not very clear, but it's from Tanya Sa, which is: do you think that the promise itself is a conversation or a win about ethics? When the priest partially indicates during the confession scene, is he saying that the institution of religion is now standing on weak grounds? And you can take it beyond the novel itself.
I'm not entirely sure how to understand the question, but I'll respond to it in the way I do understand it. I'm not, again, to pick up on an earlier point, I barely know how to live my own life, let alone prescribe for others how they should be living theirs. So, I don't see it as my job to be talking about ethics, certainly not lecturing anyone else. I have not, in each of the sections of the book, although they're describing very different political phases of the country, I have not analyzed the politics or broken them down in a way that a writer like Nadine Gordimer might have done. I'm simply trying to conjure the spirit of each of the last 3-4 decades in South Africa. And I've selected certain incidents which I think embody that spirit. But I'm not trying to make any point about it. I'm letting readers draw their own conclusions and perceive things in their own way. The religious aspect really had a practical component, because if you are going to have 4 funerals, you have to have 4 funeral services. And although most families would be buried under the umbrella of one particular religion, I thought it would be more interesting for me and for the reader to find a way to have 4 different funeral services. But there is a more serious intention with that. The religions that I've highlighted are also the major religions of white South Africa, the religions white South Africans follow. So I was trying to convey something of how complicated white South Africa's past and present is. But I wasn't thinking about, ethical concerns that the religions might focus on. That was not my That was not my intention. I mean, I would hope that readers have concerns about several ethical situations that the book raises, but I'm not stirring the pot on that front, or not trying to anyway.
Yeah. We have time, I think, for two more questions. And the next question is going to be, at one level, it's very easy, but at another level, quite complicated, because it's like you have to choose between your children. And this is from Achintya Swarup, who asks, it's a very well-written, well-crafted story. Which character did you enjoy writing about the most?
You can't write any character truly without drawing on some aspect of yourself. So in a certain way, all the characters mattered to me personally. But I suppose the character that gave me most scope, I don't know if it was enjoyment, but most engrossing absorption, was Anton, the older brother. I guess
Right.
because he's such a mess. And he's so at odds with himself, while at the same time being quite self-aware and highly intelligent. It gave me a lot of play with his inner voice, his dialogue with himself, and so on, which I have to say reflects to some extent the kind of dialogue I have with myself a lot of the time. So Anton, I think, was probably the character I had the most fun with.
Okay. And the next question is from Binodini Kanvalkar, which says basically that, do people have to atone for the sins of their forefathers? Throughout history, exploiters have never relinquished power on their own accord. It is the exploited who have to unite and fight and wrest power from their exploiters. Fine. The question is, so why should this particular family be any different? I suppose the question is about the burden of history. To what extent should a family feel burdened by the history? And it's a question of privilege, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question and not one that I know how to answer. I mean, we are in South Africa burdened with the sins of our fathers. It was not my generation that created apartheid. And in fact, it was dismantled at more or less the time that I came to adulthood. We may have continued the sin by, upholding the system, but I can't say, because it was swept away. The family I chose in particular because they're not radical either to the left or the right. I mean, they're not your typical hardcore racist white South Africans, who are a lot uglier, believe it or not, than this family. Nor are they the sort of rabidly socialist left-wing leaning family who, I know some of as well in South Africa. I wanted them to be typical in the sense that they weren't especially politically engaged, not especially aware of history either, just living their lives inside a system of inequality that actually they felt quite comfortable with because it didn't ask much of them. And of course, put them in a position of power. The one person in the family who tries to break away is Amor, the youngest daughter. And I think most readers will perceive that she doesn't have a means of doing so. She tries by cutting herself off from her family and from her inheritance, but she still, by virtue of her class and her color, is in a position of power and privilege. These are not things one can easily give up, especially under a system where your race is a kind of a destiny, which is the case in South Africa still. So, I don't know a definitive answer to your question, but I guess all of us to some degree are burdened by the past and trying to be free of it. But there may not be an easy solution to hand.
Thank you, Damon. It's been absolutely fascinating and an honor to talk to you. I've learned a lot. I also want to say that, you touched upon journalism on one hand and writing on the other, literature and journalism. And, journalists say that we are after facts, but novelists are after truth. And by that, I don't mean truth with a capital T, because there are many truths, but their own truth, the way they find, the way they negotiate it. It's not always sublime. It's sometimes unpleasant. It's harsh. It's depressing, but it makes us re-examine ourselves, and this brings doubt about the accepted certainties that we take for granted. And for doing that, thank you from all your readers, and all the very best to you.
Thank you, Salil. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Galgut and Mr. Tripathi, for that eye-opening conversation. And a huge thanks to you, our incredibly loyal and faithful audience, for joining us today online. Our next session online at 8 p.m. is Sustainable Appetite, Stopping Climate Change One Meal at a Time. George Monbiot is in conversation with Bahar Dutt. Remember to check out our website, tatalitlive.in, for the schedule and speakers, because we have many more exciting sessions lined up for you, both online today and tomorrow. And for those of you who can join us offline from in and around Mumbai, remember, you can catch us for our exciting on-ground festival starting on Friday, November 11th, Saturday, November 12th, and Sunday, November 13th at the NCPA, and also at St. Paul's Institute and Tidal Waves Bookstore on Saturday and Sunday, featuring authors and ideologues such as Gitanjali Shri, Varun Grover, Malika Sarabhai, Shashi Tharoor, Manu Pillai, and Mahesh Ilkunjwar, amongst so many other fantastic authors, journalists, and poets, talking about everything from topics like war, technology, and the economy to poetry, sports, and food. Thanks for tuning in to Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. The festival's social media handle is @Tata Lit Live across all networks. That concludes our session for today, but continue logging on to Tata Literature Live 2022, where you can enjoy turning the page. Happy reading and good evening.